Thank you, Peter, for an excellent overlook of what's ahead of us. So, between the troubled waters of bail-in and the yet not so troubled waters of Solvency II, we have some minutes for some questions, both from the audience and also from the other speakers. So, it would be interesting to interact. I would only ask for the questions to be as short as possible in the interest of time. Passando a português, portanto, abrindo a questões e pedindo que essas questões fossem sucintas no interesse do tempo. Precisaríamos do microfone.
If I ask a question,
Okay.
It's a question for Charles Goodhart. I agree with your presentation in terms of the bail-in being essentially a political concept. I just wonder if you have a view in terms of the politics around the different tax treatments of debt and equity, and whether this is also a factor in terms of the way that supervisors have... My question is about the different tax treatments of debt and equity, and whether that's also a factor in the way that supervisors have chosen the bail-in approach compared to the alternative, which would be requiring banks to hold much higher levels of equity than at present.
Yes, you're quite right. We're in a very serious position. Because of the deflationary pressures that we've had, interest rates have been brought down to terribly low levels. This has encouraged an enormous increase in debt. In many countries, notably in the United States, corporate debt increase has not been used to expand investment. It's been used to buy back equity. So the debt to equity ratio has been worsening quite rapidly. However, the world has now got into a condition where the debt ratios are enormously high. We know that we got into trouble in 2008 because debt was too high. Debt has generally increased a great deal since then, notably in China, which I know that Michael was going to be talking about later. The problem is that having got such a huge overhang of debt, if you try raising interest rates, it's going to drive a lot of sectors, a lot of companies, even some sovereigns, into real difficulty. So we're in a sort of trap. The context has led to massive debt increase because of the low interest rates, but because of the debt increase, we can't raise interest rates. So we're sort of trapped in a low interest rate, high debt world. Now, I think the way to get out of it, as Michael was indicating, was to shift the fiscal and other balances between debt and equity. Debt has got a huge sort of fiscal advantage relative to equity, and you can do it. There are various ways of providing benefits, if you like, to corporates, of raising equity, so that it's on an even level playing field with debt. There was a very good book written by Jim Mirrlees, a UK Nobel laureate, indicating ways that you could do it. It's a bit complicated. It's called ACE, and I've forgotten, being rather old, exactly what ACE stands for. But what is needed as a generality in all forms of finance is to shift from debt-type finance to equity-type finance, but it needs political leadership and international coordination to do that, and I see very little sign of that occurring.
Thank you, Charles. Other questions? Outras questões? José Maria.
Thank you very much to Peter. In the banking world, we allow internal models, and one of the things we have seen is a huge dispersion in risk-weighted assets estimation. In fact, what we call Basel IV is in the end trying to limit the dispersion of models. Now with Solvency II, insurance is going into the avenue not just of models, but of full portfolio models that are even more complicated than the models that we have seen in banking. Are you afraid of the type of problems that we have seen in banking, in the sense that, insurance companies, internal estimations, using models, go all over the place, and in a few years down the road you are faced with a dispersion like the one we have seen in the banking sector? Not an easy question, sorry.
No, it's a good question. I think it's not excluded, to be quite cautious, but I think we are very much looking to what the findings are in the banking sector. What did we find? Because at first it seems quite consequent to say if it's risk-based, and if we, as a starting point, you can imagine that standard formula in insurance is quite complicated already, because you have all these underwriting insurance type of risks there as well, and they are pretty complicated. Catastrophe risk to calibrate that across Europe is a nightmare. Yeah? So it's quite complicated. I remember when one of my colleagues had one of these presentation sheets, and I think, I know it's pretty complex, these internal models, and he said, no, we are still in the standard formula. So, and you need, what is the fallback now? You set incentives to say, look, it's better to have this internal model because there is no really fair calibration. And if you think it through, it's clear. We are very, very much looking to why, what are the reasons that bankers became so unhappy about internal models. And one thing that is even more difficult for us is, if you look for partial internal models, that makes things even sometimes more difficult because of the interconnection between the liabilities and the way you need to treat your assets. For example, the duration of assets, it's complete. You have a range from hail insurance, a very liquid class of insurance, towards long-term annuities type of business. So that's clear. So my answer cannot be very clear, but I know we are very well aware of looking to that. And I tell you, no secret that on the international level, we are not yet sure whether internal models will find their way into the global capital standards.
The fact is that over-reliance on internal models has acquired quite a bad name in banking, so that's a cause for concern, at least potentially. Other questions? So I would abuse my prerogative as moderator to also address a short question to Charles, which is somehow relevant to the current Portuguese debate, and that's, I confess, somehow the reason that impels me to put this question, and also to try to assess if I misunderstood what you've said in Frankfurt in last November at the SSM conference. And I think that at that time, beside your substantive critique of resolution and bail-in, you also produced an institutional critique about the separation of functions of banking supervision and resolution. I'm not sure if I correctly understood your point at that time. It's an important issue nowadays in Portugal because it's somehow debated the possible reorganization of resolution functions here in Portugal, and we would very much like to benefit from your insight on this institutional aspect also of resolution versus banking supervision.
In those countries in which banking supervision is included in the central bank, and that includes my country, and effectively it includes the continental countries as well, because most of the really big banks will be jointly supervised by the SSM and the National Central Bank. And so it's going to be the ECB and the relevant National Central Bank that knows most about the situation. So on if you like, the week coming up to the point at which there's resolution, it's the central bank is the repository of information. And then, after the resolution has taken place through one route or another, on the Monday, when the operating subsidiary has to restart, it's the central bank again, which is actually going to have to keep the thing afloat by putting in liquidity, because as I said, the reputational hit and the confusion between the, if you like, the holding company, which has now been dissolved, and the operating subsidiary, which is continuing, will not be clear to the mass of people. They'll wonder whether the operating subsidiary really is going on. So there is, in all likelihood, there's going to be a fairly large run on the operating subsidiary in the subsequent week. And the central bank's got to put money in. So sort of Monday to Friday, and the thing gets resolved, it's the central bank. And the next Monday to Friday, it's again the central bank. So if the central bank has got to do most of the work and knows most of the information, it just seems to me to be sensible to put the resolution exercise with the central bank as well. And they've got a single resolution board which isn't as clued up about the institution that needs to be resolved, and isn't in charge of the instruments which are going to be necessary to keep that operating subsidiary going afterwards. And what I find it just very difficult to understand exactly what the purpose of having this separate single resolution board and actually what it is. Could I put it back to you? Why does it not make sense to keep the whole thing?
I have impediments to speak about that.
And it just seems to be a completely unnecessary increase in a separate institutional setup. I just don't understand what the basis of the exercise is. And there are people who undoubtedly feel that central banks have had too much power for their democratic, because they're not democratically elected institutions. But I don't think having a single resolution board is a sensible way of dealing with this particular problem. Why divide over a number of institutions when you can concentrate the expertise effectively in a single institution?
Well, we could put forward the case that European Union rules put forward some important forms of interaction between the supervisor and the resolution authority, but really here I feel some institutional impediments to comment further. If there are no questions, and thanking very much for most stimulating presentations, both by Peter and Charles, we'll then interrupt for a break. And we'll resume at noon. So vamos fazer curto intervalo e recomeçar ao meio-dia sharp. Muito obrigado.